So welcome today to the UCI Great Big Read. We'll be getting started shortly. Thank you.
Oops. Not really.
Well, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us, UCI Great Big Read, and please welcome Vice Chancellor Douglas Haynes.
Thank you so much, Marguerite. I am so pleased and humbled to welcome you to our UCI Great Big Read today, featuring Julia Alvarez. As those of you know, joining us, Mrs. Alvarez's recent book, Afterlife, is the selected common reading at UCI for this month. Before welcoming Professor Alvarez to join us, I also want to thank Professor Anita Casavantes Bradford, a professor in the Department of Chicano Latino Studies, for joining us to facilitate the conversation today with our distinguished author. The UCI Great Big Read is a partnership with the Office of Inclusive Excellence, UCI Libraries, and the Division of Student Affairs. It's aimed at fostering engagement and social solidarity during a current time of physical distancing. We are aiming to bridge understanding during challenging times, and I could think of no one more equipped to enter such a conversation than our distinguished guest, Julia Alvarez. You have read that she is a recipient of the National Medal of Arts, the highest honor bestowed by the US government to artists and art patrons. She also has been recognized with many other accolades, including a National Critics Circle Book Award nomination for In the Time of the Butterflies, and a Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award for How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents. She is an acclaimed poet, novelist, and author in fiction and nonfiction, and in adult and children's literature. Her list of honors reconciles this amazing range, including the Pura Beltre and the Americas Awards for her books for young readers, the Hispanic Heritage Award in Literature, and the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award for Outstanding Achievement in American Literature. However, first and foremost, Julia Alvarez is our cultural teacher and cultural conscience. Whether formally teaching at Middlebury College or continually teaching all of us through her writing, she demands our consideration of the immigrant experience. She has given us the firsthand insights about escaping tyranny, has connected us to timely comparisons about current times when considering the resilience through other crises. She also has taught us the important lesson of caring for humanity. And hopefully this will be a legacy that we who admire her work will be inspired for change and consideration of one another. There's a line in her recent poem about the pandemic that asks, what if only poetry will see us through? And I believe that it is so valuable to have her art forcing our reflection about the compassion needed to move through and beyond current challenges. I am particularly humbled to ask Julia Alvarez to join us at UCI. And please join me in welcoming Julia as she begins with a brief reading. Welcome.
Wow, thank you. You're making me cry. Whoever she is, she sounds great. Thank you, Vice Chancellor Haynes and Professor Anita Casavantes Bradford, who gave me permission later to call her Anita, for this welcome. Boy, that stirs my heart. It's an honor to be chosen for the Great Big Read, and reading a little bit about what you're trying to do with this program. Plus, I have to say very quickly, I'm very grateful to you because I had never read Octavia Butler's Kindred. What a treat. But I had to get it quickly. So I got the audiobook, and it's my first audiobook. And I do it during yoga, and my yoga sessions have stretched. So that's also a good thing. I'm going to read from the beginning because it's a little easier when you're giving a reading. You don't have to mention a whole lot of things about what has happened. And in this prologue, it's a very different style. Those of you who have read the book can see from the regular narrative of the rest of the novel. It's called Broken English, and we meet Antonia, who will be our character, our guide, our point of view through the novel. So Broken English. She is to meet him, a place they often choose for special occasions, to celebrate her retirement from the college, a favorite restaurant, and the new life awaiting her. A half-hour drive from their home, a mountain town, 20 if she speeds in the 30-mile zone. Tonight it makes more sense. A midway point, to arrive separately, as she will be driving down from her doctor's appointment. She gets there first, as he will be driving from home. He should have been there before her. She starts calling his cell after waiting 10, 20 minutes. He doesn't answer. Irritation turns to worry. No surprise. He always leaves it behind in his work jeans pocket. The hospital, 911, the police, have you seen him? Or turns off the sound at the movies and then forgets to turn it back on. Can you please help me find him? Or turns off the sound at the movies and forgets to turn it back on. Can you please help me find him? Even now, months later, about 6 feet, thinning hair, a boy's blue eyes, which he knows good and well, dusk deepening. How he had been driving up the mountain. He feels a stab of pain, already thinking of what he might order, coming from his left side, but radiating out, wondering about her state of mind. The special, if it is special, if she would be excited or terrified, or his default favorite, salmon with lemon dill sauce, like a sword piercing his left side. Substituting mashed potatoes for the fries, they're very good about substitutions. Though how would he know what it feels like to have a sword piercing his left side? Because of his medical training, understanding what is happening, not wanting to cause more harm. Pronounced dead on arrival. He forgets to charge it and it runs out of juice. Even now, 3 months shy of a year later, pulling his car off the road, rolling gently to a stop, which he knows exactly what happened. A ditch that might as well be his grave, discovered by a passing cyclist, rushed to the ER. Why he was late. A ruptured aortic aneurysm, as he is to be cremated and therefore have no grave per se. Neither he nor she could have foreseen, even now, a boy's blue eyes, and cannot comprehend how someone she loved. She keeps running and rerunning that night in her head. Can you please help me find him? Can be nothing but dust, unread emails, fragments, unpaid bills, memories, broken glass, dented bumper, a new life awaiting her, both terrified and excited. How can it be? Can you help me find him? Tall with thinning hair, a new life awaiting her. Can you help me find him? A mystery she cannot by any means solve. Nevertheless, she keeps asking, where are you? As this is the only way she knows. Can you help me find him? How to create an afterlife for him.
Thank you so much for that reading. And I'd like to begin by just saying what an incredible honor this is for me. I have been a fan of La Profesora Julia since I read How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents in the early 90s when I was a Cuban-Irish college girl at school in Vancouver, Canada. The daughter of a Cuban exile who never let me forget that we would always be exiles and that my home was not really my home. For me, Julia Alvarez's work, which spoke of cultural loss, which spoke of dislocation, family trauma, resonated on so many levels. And as I then continued to read her work and began my own tentative efforts at writing fiction myself, I came to appreciate even more the precise beauty of her craft, which I interpret as both an immigrant and a poet's attention to words and the order in which they are arranged. And I'm thrilled that she's returned to fiction with Afterlife, which takes on the issues of loss and grief in ways that are devastating and yet unflinchingly unsentimental, while also offering us a very, a ruthlessly honest assessment of the tensions between people's professed values and the fears and the instinct towards self-protection that so often stop us from doing the right thing. Life is an exhausting, illusion-shattering, liberating, and ultimately hopeful book. And thank you, Profesora Julia, for writing it.
Thank you for that assessment.
So my first question, we'll start easy and then work our way up to the more challenging questions. Was there a specific moment in which you decided to write this book? And if so, why? And was there an image or a situation or a line of dialogue or description that captured your imagination?
Well, my publisher sort of shocked me by reminding me in their press release that this was going to be my first novel in almost 15 years. I've been writing books for young readers and poems and so forth, but it was the first one. And it took me that long because I think I was trying to write, I didn't want to repeat the things that I already had done and knew how to do. I just felt like part of my responsibility to my readers is to keep growing and learning and pushing that boundary for myself, or I'm just, following a formula. And I say it took me this long because it's my first novel as an elder. And I was needing to integrate what that meant in my life in order to be able to reflect that in a character. I also felt a growing sense, and this was even before the pandemic, that we were living in elegiac times. That's the way I thought of it. Seeing the end of so many things, from climate change, extinct species, storms and coastal towns going underwater, divisiveness, gun violence, violence against communities of color, which was going on before the pandemic, the end of civil discourse and coming together. I just felt like so many things were being broken and lost. And the question that drove me, if there was like an impulse, is how do we live in a broken world without losing faith in each other or ourselves? How do we move it forward? But not by saying, by ignoring the things, but moving through that storm and seeing what we can salvage from it. So I think that's what drove me with this character.
So I have a question from the audience. Somebody would like you to talk a little bit about your writing process and how you write for different audiences. You're returning to fiction for adults now. Do you prefer one audience or one style? And has that preference changed over time?
No, well, I think there have been evolutions. I think I'm a storyteller, and it comes very much from my, Dominican roots, my growing up in a oral culture, basically. There were no readers in my family, especially in the 1950s among women. That was, no more education than high school. But I was raised by wonderful storytellers, and storytellers don't say, now I'm going to tell a story and all of you don't belong here. I'm really always interested in inclusiveness, even in my readership, all ages. And I think of my books for young adults as written for children of all ages. So I don't have a preference. That said, I started writing for young people when I was started a project with my husband in the Dominican Republic, a literacy project. And I saw that so many of the books were translations, not just from English to Spanish, but of American El Norte experiences. And I wanted to put some of our stories out there for them. So that was the impulse, wanting to, I always think of my writing as coming directly from my life. They're very interconnected. It's something that happens, and I think of it as a pebble in my shoe. I can't shake it out until I begin writing. So that's very much what compels me. Do I have a writing process? Let me put it this way. I have a writing life. And the byproduct of it are the books that you hold. But it is a writing life. It's a life of the ongoingness of this connection to a greater community, a greater world than my little limited self in my little Vermont. It's a way that I live my life. And many times I don't even know what I think or feel until I write. So out of that comes, I don't think of myself as producing product or copy or a consumer item. it's a writing life, it's a calling. And out of that comes sometimes a book, and sometimes for 15 years, no adult novel, but it is, it is what it is. And one of the things I compare it to is like, maybe because I was also raised in a Catholic culture, that the nuns were always talking to us about, some of us might have a calling to the religious life. Well, I think I always love that idea of a calling to do something, a pull that is bigger than you. And so I think of writing that way, as that, and so when people say, do you write? Do you try to write like every day or on a regular schedule? I think I breathe, I live, and writing is part of that.
That's lovely. Two more questions from our audience that tie into that. One of them says, Profesora Julia, when you write your books, do you initially write them in Spanish or English? And then, since the other question is related, I'll just tack it on. One of our audience members wants to know, what spaces encourage you to be creative? Do you work in the park, at a desk, in the library? And how do those spaces make their way into your work?
Oh, wow, that's also a very good one. Oh, they're both so good. I do not write in Spanish. Afterlife just got translated by a Colombiana who lives in Mexico, Mercedes Gul, with some help from a Dominicana editor friend of mine. And they sent it to me, and I am totally frustrating to them because I can tell them when it doesn't sound right, but I can't tell them how to fix it. I came to this country in 1960, pre-bilingual education, pre-everything, that we think of today. So we were actually discouraged from continuing with our Spanish.
Yes.
The nuns would, send complaints home if they caught my sisters. I mean, we were Spanish dominant then, speaking Spanish. So that was not encouraged. As a result, the language que aprendí a dominar, to craft, to move in, to think in, to fashion, is English. That said, as I get older, I can see that I'm writing my Spanish in English. Because of my Spanish and that mother tongue, the rhythms, the way I experience syntax, the way the clusters of details I use, the way I think of a sentence or a rhythm has so much to do with that Spanish undergirding of my English. So I think, I think these either ors are really problematic. Are you this or are you that? It's always such a interweaving, and I'm learning to respect that and not feeling that I have to choose, no matter who tells me that I have to. In terms of a writing space, that's so interesting because, now that we're all shuttered here in Vermont and everything's closed, I have some writers who are friends that are really suffering because they go to cafes to write. They need people around them. The loneliness of writing means that they have to create community around them when they write. And that's where they do their best writing. And I can't do that because I'm too curious, let's put it. If there's a sound, I want to listen to it. If there's something going on, I want to pay attention to it. I can't even put on music. I start listening to it. So I do have a writing space that is downstairs from this room. And it's, I'm lucky this way finally, because I used to write, I used to live in one-room apartments, and I would write in the same room I slept, cooked, ate in. But now I have the luxury of going to a space that I know is just for that when I enter. And that really helps. And, my Caribbean background, I have my little altar, my little bowl of water. And I know this is not, it's like when mommy used to pin an azabache, a good luck charm on our undershirts and later bras before we took an exam. I'm sure they didn't help me with my SATs, but it helped my sense that I was that I was safe with that on. So
Which probably helped you with your SATs.
SATs. So I do have rituals. And I think every writer, whether they're Caribbean or not, you know, it might just be a favorite pen or a favorite kind of notebook or whatever, but we all have our little ways of meeting this mystery.
I love that. Yes, because writing can be terrifying at times. You
Yes.
need whatever.
The duende that
Exactly.
Lorena talks about, you know? You're meeting this amazing force and power, and you have to be its channeled and focused. You don't control it, you know, but you give yourself these little magical ways of moving through it.
Amen.
Sí, sí, sí.
So another one of our audience members wanted you to talk about sisterhood, which of course is a constant theme in your writing. I'm struck by how the tensions between individuality and the bonds of family keeps coming up in your writing, and it comes up again in Afterlife. Our audience member wants to know, do you have a favorite sister that you've written in any of your novels, and which sister in Afterlife do you resemble the most?
Well, because of because of the similarities, I find, of course, a kind of kinship with Antonia, and she shares some of my literary and biographical DNA. That said, I'm never interested in writing about myself. Julia Alvarez is my world, my person in the world, my research body. And I need her and what she knows and has gathered in creating character. But when I'm writing, it's really, it's what works in the story and what works within that character. That said, I find that whenever I write, I have to become the other in order to credibly write about them. So even though, for instance, with In the Time of the Butterflies, I entered that novel, just so passionate about Minerva. Oh, what a firebrand. Oh, what a moral imagination. And yet, I fell in love with Maria Teresa. I really began to understand, even though I thought she was going to be the hardest because she was so religious, Patria, and her sort of, glorious, spiritual soul, and so each one, you become the other. It's part of what I find so liberating about reading and writing. So do I have a favorite sister? I think as I write each one, I'm connected with them. And the other thing that I find too is, you mentioned the tensions. When you come from a close family, you're given these little roles, and they can sometimes really, they're wonderful because you operate as a unit. And one of the things we learned very much in our Latinx cultures is to be a we, not just a me. And I love that. That said, sometimes those descriptions and those labels, like any labels, culturally, socially, politically, really prevent you from discovering those areas in yourself that might be uncomfortable, but that might stretch you into becoming a bigger version of yourself. So you come from a family and you instantly sort of, you're the responsible one. You're the oldest. You're the baby. You're the one that's good at math. And come to discover, when you sort of leave the environs of a family, hey, you know how to fix the lamp too. You know how to balance the checkbook. You know how to cook when you have to. So it's that dynamic that I'm interested in, rather than airbrushing it into one or the other.
I think that's probably resonates for many of our audience members who are from big Latina families, and those of us that are familiar with our roles in the family. One of the things I've always appreciated about your writing is your refusal to paint Latinx characters into boxes, to treat them as if they were archetypes instead of individuals, and to just recognize all of the ways that our Latinx experiences are different. based on our gender, our race, our class, our citizenship status. And I thought that the relationship between Antonia, Mario, and Estela really revealed some of those ways in which there are shared experiences, but also really dramatic differences amongst US Latinx folks. And so I was hoping you could just talk about what did you want to show through those dynamics between Antonia, Mario, and Estela?
Thank you for highlighting that, and for also by saying so, reminding us how important it is to allow diversity within a group, not just out there in the greater culture, that we are myriad, and we don't want to narrow ourselves down, that there is a right way to be this, a Latinx person, a wrong way, or we begin to close down our communities and make either ors, which I keep returning to. They are so dangerous. So yeah, part of the dynamic that I wanted to explore was that kind of diversity. Instead of airbrushing, this is a certain kind, we are Latinx and we have these beliefs and we act in this ways, to grant ourselves the full complexity, because that is true freedom. And I've just been rereading, I've just spent I guess the last couple of months rereading so many of Toni Morrison's work that I had read as a young person, and I decided to return to it. And one of the things I love about her is, first of all, she said, I'm not going to write for the white gaze. I want to write about my community. But she never makes that community, just this airbrush. There's complexity, there's evil, people betray each other, people kill each other. And it just is so glorious and full and acknowledging of all that a community can be. And I really wanted to get at that, and also get at some of the complexities, as you mentioned, because we are such a diverse, this umbrella of Latinx. I mean, we speak different languages even, there's native languages, indigenous languages. We're different races, mixtures, hybridity is like our main description. Different classes, different experiences. And we have to, in entering the larger community and wanting to be recognized, we don't want to be put in a box. We want that full range, and to acknowledge the ways in which we're different and respect that. So important, because that's really how we grant ourselves the diversity that we're asking for in the larger community.
So tying into that, one of our audience members just posted a question about one of the similarities between Antonia and Estela, that they have this shared hunger for words and language and to sort of name the world that they're in. And so the audience member wants to know, how do you think that the immigrant experience influences or shapes or fuels this linguistic kind of challenge that both of the characters are?
Right, and curiosity. When I first started writing, I thought of the fact that I hadn't started in English, especially because I had a writing professor. Imagine hearing this, your first day of a writing workshop, that no one could ever write good poetry. It was a poetry workshop, unless their mother tongue had been English. And I thought, oh no, oh my gosh. And it was a very important professor. And so it was like Moses and the tablet of the commandments. I thought I'll never make it. So for a while, I felt like I was 10 years behind, because I hadn't learned English till I was 10. I was 10 years behind all my fellow writers. I would never catch up. I would never belong. And now I see something else, that being an immigrant, I had to learn what every writer has to learn, even in their native tongue. As a writer, you have to relearn language so that you're paying attention to the little particularities, the little triggers that one word brings about and not another, the little reputations they have, the sensations. And you're constantly doing that as an immigrant because you know if you say one word, you get a certain reaction and another word. So you're learning the language in a conscious way that a writer has to relearn it as a writer, even if it's their native tongue. So now I see that curiosity and carefulness, why if you said that someone was, really skinny, was that different from saying slender? They like slender. They didn't like skinny. They like, full body. They didn't like fat. I mean, and how to do weight, but that there were ways of speaking that I had to learn very, very consciously. And I think that's great, training for a writer. And the other thing with Estella is that, like I mentioned before, when I started writing, I thought, well, I didn't start out as a big reader. I didn't have that kind of training, but I had oral storytellers. And one of the things that I realized in graduate school in a creative writing program is that everything I was learning, I had learned in my childhood, sometimes from storytellers that hadn't gone past fourth grade, sometimes from people in the campo that told an amazing tale and they didn't even know how to read or write. That what Spike Lee once said, one of the great lessons in his life is that you can learn from people who are dumber than you, or you think they're dumber than you, but they're not, And so, Estella has that same curiosity, and through her, it refreshes and alerts Antonia to, the words for things, and how to say things,
I think that's one example of one of the things I love about your work is the way that the poet's sensibility is there even in your fiction. That sort of reverence for individual words, I think, is part of the poet's gift and the immigrant's gift.
Well, I think also that sometimes it's a pain in the butt because I'm so particular, about a sentence, and I keep thinking, Emily Dickinson once said that there are no approximate words in a poem. Prose can be much more forgiving, and I forget that.
Someone who has spent an hour contemplating whether to use the or I feel you.
Yeah.
So I would like to talk about Antonia, the reluctant activist who is constantly resisting this, what you call moral profiling based on ethnicity. The idea that because she is a Latina, she's automatically conferred a certain radical political stance or virtue, or that she is automatically a Mother Teresa. And we see through the novel that she is in fact drawn in to becoming, in her own way, an advocate and an activist, that her life perspective, her Spanish language skills, this reluctant solidarity that she feels, draw her in. And so there's this tension here as well, in which Antonia is struggling with, what is my responsibility? What is the minimum that one owes one another? Are you telling us that as Latinx folks, as folks of color, as folks from marginalized communities, that we are in fact responsible? Do our identities confer on us maybe not a predisposition, but a responsibility?
I think our humanity does. I don't think it should be, and I think it's dangerous if it's just assigned to a certain particular group. And I think that's why reading is so important and stories are so important, because when you read, it's as simple as this: you become the other. And that is the important thing that I think I finally came to with Antonia, that more than having the right politics or list of what to do, is cultivating a moral imagination. I think it's why teaching is so important. Reading is so important, because if you have that, then you move through the world, and whatever your little quirks and personality and little irritabilities and little self and selfishness, cling to, having that will save you, will save all of us. And I think cultivating that is sometimes, oh, you're going to automatically be this way or that. I don't trust people who are automatically this way or that. That's just a rubber stamp. And I think more critical and more important is cultivating the kind of moral imagination that allows you to see complexity and put yourself also in the mix, and lets you act out of that kind of place in yourself and out of your strengths, because that's what's going to be sustainable. If what you're giving is based on that passion in yourself, what was it that Howard Thurman says? I'm gonna mess it up, so I wish I could find it because I have it in my notebook here. But it's something like don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come awake, because what the world needs is people who are awake. So, it's not a rubber stamp. And one of the things I wanted to create with Antonia is that her Anglo-white Midwestern husband is really the radical in the family. And everyone assumes it's Antonia because she's the Latinx, so she radicalized him. So I wanted to complicate that. So I think it behooves all of us to have that kind of compassion, not just because we're Latinx or because we're Black or because we, are immigrants, because we're people. We belong to each other as well as to ourselves.
There's an issue of sort of skills and resources too, isn't there? I mean, the world's needs are infinite, and, we're responsible for what we see, and our identities, our experiences shape what we see. And so for better or for worse, Antonia, who is a Spanish speaker, who is an immigrant, is able to see and respond to Mario and Estela in certain ways. Not perfectly, because she's of a totally different class, she's of a different generation. But so I guess that is what I'm trying to get at, is not that she would be rubber stamped or predisposed to be sympathetic to them, but that because of the resources she has, because of her identity, in Spider-Man, they talk about with great power comes great responsibility. Is responsibility that comes with what we see because of our identities as immigrants, as Latinx folks, as, fill in the blank, whatever.
Well, as you said, because we have particular identities and come from particular places, there is, sure, you could say, well, there's greater need or something going on over there, but because we have those capabilities, because for many of us, we are so aware, we can never forget how lucky we've been, how close we are for it to have been a different story. There does come a responsibility. I think what I was getting at is that that by cultivating a moral imagination, you cannot close down the ways that you are responsible for other people. And who to start with but your own community, the circle the tribe you come from. Because other people will have their elders and their facilitators and their advocates, but you've gotten certain skills and certain powers. And, I always love that my friend Sandra Cisneros, the end of the house on Mango Street, where, the speaker says, I will come back. She promises the people in the neighborhood, I will come back for the others, for the ones who have not been able to get out. And that sense of, you do feel that compulsion to help, because You know, when you see these kids at the border and you see that wrenching look and you see that terror, that could so easily have been you had you not been so lucky, you
Right,
know?
right.
So,
That leads that leads to the next question I wanted to ask you about. And this is sort of a rambling question, so please draw from it whatever you can.
sure.
You described the undocumented workers on Roger's farm as his dirty little secret, and something that he does to survive. And it seems to me that undocumented labor is one of our country's dirty little secrets, not just Roger's dirty little secret. And I think of the relationship between slavery and undocumented folks in our nation's history, who has picked our food, who has tended our homes, raised our children. And you know, in this moment of COVID-19, Black Lives Matters, we see again how these histories are linked, right? And how brown and Black communities are suffering. And so I guess my question is, are you letting him off too easily in the book where you describe this as his dirty little secret, something he does to survive? And then we see Sheriff Boyer as well in the end. Both of these characters, Roger and Sheriff Boyers, are both sort of redeemed by these individual acts of decency. And while I believe in the necessity of individual decency, I wonder if by focusing on individual acts of decency, are we letting the country off the hook too easily? And so what is, in your mind, how do we bring together the importance of individual dignity, individual decency and compassion, and also advocating for structural change?
Well, I think the bigger change happens because of these small individual people coming awake. That's how it's done. You can't legislate it. I mean, we've tried. You know, it's got to be transformation. It's got to be systemic change, not just in the society, but internally. And what I guess I wanted for Antonia, for all of us, is it's not to close it down too quickly, to stay open to the possibility of being surprised by people, and by the little acts of conscience and opening, maybe too small, when, you know, we feel such impatience and such urgency, and we see the toll that it's taking in communities of color. This pandemic, and before then, but this pandemic has really highlighted it. So again, you know, it's this tricky thing of, it needs to happen quickly, but it also needs to happen internally. And so, yeah, I'm not, you know, it's funny also because I'm not letting anybody off the hook because I'm writing a story. I'm not, I want to reflect the full complexity of how it happens, not impose or colonize my fiction with how it should happen, with me as, you know, the moral arbiter. I want to show people as they are, but by someone maybe reading it, who has maybe some of the same impulses and seeing the possibility of opening, that maybe that begins to shift things around. And believe me, I have seen people in this community who had their opinions about illegal people, little farmers whose farms were going bankrupt, suddenly taking in a Mexican family, and they're eating together, and they're together. They have changed. It is sometimes too painfully slow, and I don't know that we can afford this pace. We got to go quicker. But for me, that's how it happens, at that atomic level of internal systemic transformation, and combining that, you know, that with activism. That's so important as well.
I love that. I think that that's important, is that we understand that the change is a multifaceted process, and we are implicated, our hearts are implicated, as well as the structures. I have a thank you note for you from an audience member. It says, Just a thank you note. 10 years ago, I was an off-the-boat immigrant from Eastern Europe, and I settled in a Dominican barrio in New York City. Your books not only helped me navigate through my own immigration journey, but also opened my eyes to the history and experiences of my fellow new Americans born on La Española.
Oh, wow. Thank you. That speaks in part to what we've been talking about, that, this is the thing too, when you read a book, it's not just for a certain targeted group that has shared the same experience. I mean, what's so amazing about reading is you find yourself in so many different types of people. It enlarges you. I can't say enough how much I feel like, by reading, you're exercising the muscles of your imagination. And that's what shows social justice is in the social realm, that, you are those muscles of compassion that get enlarged by reading are the muscles you need for activism and change out there.
You talk about a bleak world of self-protection, everyone barricaded against the suffering of others, hoarding their investment in their privatized versions of reality. And it seems to me that this book is saying that one of the way outs from that is imagination, is poetry, is beauty. But I also feel a strong spiritual current running through it. In the end, Antonia is becoming a Zen practitioner, and she's amazed by the beauty of a broken plate that's been put back together, and of this sort of simplicity and profundity of Zen spirituality. And so I wanted to ask you, what is the role of spirituality in your life and in your art and in your activism?
Oh, that's the ground of it all, because it's also a larger world than even our species. And, this activism in terms of climate and in terms of what we need to do to survive on it makes us aware that it is a larger and bigger world than just even our little human species. So, yeah, I think as I grow older, and this is part of, because I talked about how this is my first novel written as an elder, because I needed to integrate some things. As you grow older, it's happening to me, is more aware of the mystery, of the largeness of it all. Of, I reading Toni Morrison, as I mentioned earlier, she says that what she wanted to do in her novels is to get to this place of huge silence. Amazing to think of that with someone who had such power of language, to get to this place of huge silence that contains us all, And I think that's part of what Antonia is moving towards in terms of the novel, and a sense of also, when you think of the term afterlife, which my editor was a little worried that people would think it was some sort of Christian tract by the novel. But I think, part of it is also realizing, as we lose so many of the people we love, and in Latinx families, it's great that we're so huge, but it means that when a generation starts to die, you don't just lose one auntie and one uncle, you lose tons of tias, tios, primos, primas, abuelos, it's huge. And it starts to feel monumental, but to feel that, that the people you've lost, that they're inside you, that you are bigger than that self. And the way to not lose them completely is to give them an afterlife by embodying the best things in them that you love. So I think that happens as you grow older, that sense of you're living with all these people too, and in a larger universe. And you're less and less interested, I think, or can be, in, the little gasoline that ran the fuel, the gasoline, and sorry about the fossil fuel analogy, that ran that little ego and that self, that's no longer what drives you. You've proven what, in many ways, you wanted to prove to yourself. And there's a bigger I don't know what to call it, mystery that you're moving into. So yeah, that's very much a part of Antonia's evolution, you know. Yeah.
Well, I have two more questions for you before we
I'll
wrap.
try to be brief. Talk about random.
No, not at all. I think we've all really enjoyed your answers. The next question is, you are, of course, a writer. You are also a teacher and a literacy activist. And I'd like to know what it is about literacy as a cause that is so important to you. And then the second part of that is, what are your other causes and how can we support them?
Oh, wow. Wow. Well, I think I've mentioned enough times and can't emphasize it enough that reading and access to the other people's experiences, other people's worlds, other people's psyches is a way to become what I use this term, larger versions of ourselves, of our individual selves too. And I mean, the facts are out there. The UN Council on Development says, especially with young girls, you teach a young girl to read and you start to save a village. You know, you give them a certain power and access to a larger world, more self-determination and more agency. So I think literacy is so important to develop, and it's, you know, it's sort of a basic thing, because, you know, I keep talking about how I'm a writer and my stories are the legacy of all that are in our human family. But if you don't know how to read, you don't have access. You can't open that treasure chest, which belongs to you too. So literacy is just super important. What other causes? Well, you know, I want to give a shout out to a movement, two movements that I've been involved in. One of them is happening right now, and you can go online and find it. It's called the Shaharasat Project. And I've had this idea since we have a sultan in the White House. And, you know, I don't know if you know the story of the Arabian Nights. Shaharasat lives under a cruel sultan who's killing all the women in her kingdom, but she saves the kingdom, her own life and the life of all the women, by telling stories. Stories that transform the sultan over the course of 1,001 nights. Well, I have no hopes of transforming the White House, but a group of artists, women, artists, activists, every night for 101 nights. We began on July 25th at 8 p.m. live. Each one has a night as she performs a story. It can be telling a story, it can be dancing, it can be showing a painting, it can be playing a piece of music. And every night we've now been on, I think this is going to enter our third week, telling stories. And it's part of encouraging women to feel that their art can be used in the effort to change things. And at the end and at the beginning, we say, you know, this is art, and the activism has to be followed through. So we urge people to vote. That's the big message, to get the vote out. And we are doing this every night, the Shaharasat Project, until November 2nd, the eve of the election. And we're determined that we're going to, you know, this is part of our effort. So go 8 p.m. And if you miss it, you can go on the website and see past episodes and be a part of it. And I'll talk about the other things some other time, because I see that our time has
Okay, well, that I will be looking that up.
And join us, Anita. Any
Okay.
woman can join and post submit a story, and we'll try to schedule it. Some nights we might have 2 or 3.
Muy bien. I'll look for it. Okay, final question before I turn it back over to Vice Chancellor Haynes. And this is a simple question. You can choose one of the 3. Juan Luis Guerra, Chichi Peralta, or Romeo Santos?
Well, how could when Well, first of all of it. But when I think of our project, which was a literacy slash cooperative for coffee farmers, I have to pick the man who wrote Ojalá que llueva café en el
En
campo.
el campo, exactamente. Bueno, muchísimas gracias, profesora.
Anita, thank you. Wonderful questions. Thank you so much.
It was truly an honor. Please keep writing for us.
The writing life. Yes.
You know, I wish we can continue indefinitely, but sadly, we're approaching the end point of this program. And on behalf of the UCI Great Big Read, Julia Alvarez, I want to thank you. This has been such an inspirational visit with you. I want to acknowledge and extend my thanks to my colleague, Professor Casavante Bradford, for just weaving questions to open up our imagination. This UCI Great Big Read would not be possible without our Assistant Vice Chancellor, Marguerite Bonnet-Hammerth, in overseeing and facilitating our team from the Office of Inclusive Excellence. And I also want to acknowledge again our partners in bringing the UCI Great Big Read to you all. And they include UCI Libraries and the Division of Student Affairs. And finally, and above all, I want to extend a thanks, an acknowledgement, and appreciation to the large expanding audience of the UCI Great Big Read. Reading is power, as Julia Alvarez mentioned, and I think it's a powerful way to form and expand our community. And so I want to invite you to look at the chat box to follow up on Julia's initiative, but also reach out and consult our website to learn more about future programming. And again, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Julia Alvarez, for what you do.
Thank you to all of you and to your audience that I don't get to see. And Anita, to your person behind you who has been so wonderful, nodding.
This is my goddaughter, Gabriela, who is also a big fan of yours.
Okay. She's just comforted me with her smiles and nods. And yep, thank you all. Thank you all for having me. And maybe someday we will do this in real time, as they say.
Yes.
Bye-bye.